there has been a long and storied history of catastrophizing over the future of NATO. It is not so long ago that Emmanuel Macron was declaring its brain death. Does the current moment feel qualitatively different to you, or are you still optimistic in broad terms about the future of the alliance?
I am optimistic about the future of the alliance because I never viewed the creation of EU defense instruments as a real obstacle to NATO. And in fact, I think the hope would be that what happens over the next few years is that Europe takes strong action both in investing in its defense and rearming Europe, as Ursula von der Leyen said, but also in organizing themselves more as Europeans. And that I would include the UK, EU, and in that as well. And so that what we then have is that a situation where NATO continues. The US is not, I don't think, going to fully withdraw, but I think it's going to be neglected for the next 4 years. And that's kind of what happened during the first Trump term, where there was summits, but no one really wanted to hold the summits by the end of the Trump administration. They were probably doing more harm than good. And there's been probably too many summits in general. So maybe we turn down the summitry. NATO is a kind of coordination, Paul Mill diplomatic organization to kind of connect allies and partners. But then, the hope would be that if eventually the United States turns back and wants to re-embrace NATO and the transatlantic alliance, we end up doing so more as co-equal partners between the US and Europe, as opposed to what NATO has been, which is effectively a US not just led security alliance, but a US dominated security alliance where everything ran through the United States. And it wasn't so much a partnership, but Europeans were effectively dependent on the US. And then we have something more balanced. And I think that would in some ways make the transatlantic alliance stronger and healthier. And I actually would think would make NATO a more valuable institution to us in Washington, because Europe would then be bringing a lot to the table and could contribute not just to deterring Russia, but to perhaps Indo-Pacific, perhaps the Middle East. But we're a long way from there because Europe needs to reinvest and reorganize itself. And hopefully that happens over the next few years without a major security crisis intervening.
Last year, NATO celebrated its 75th anniversary here in Washington. What was the sense less than 12 months ago of the most urgent problems currently facing NATO?
It was NATO's birthday. It was the 75th anniversary of NATO. Yet I think the summit was filled with anxiety. Of course, that was happening immediately following the catastrophic debate performance by President Biden, the real sense of uncertainty about whether Biden would remain as the Democratic candidate, and real sense of concern about what a potential Trump presidency would mean for the future of the alliance. And so I think in retrospect, some might go back and say that wasn't really a birthday party, but more of a wake, of a funeral for what could be a real shift in the future of the alliance that then has come after that. So we're at a very different place now from where we were in Washington last summer.
How would you characterize the gravity of the current situation and what seem now to be potentially existential threats for the alliance?
The situation is really grave for European security. And I think that comes from a few directions. One, let's just assume that there is a ceasefire in Ukraine, that President Trump is able to negotiate that. On the one hand, I think that might be good news for Ukraine. On the other, we do know that the Russian military machine has been fully mobilized and I think is not going to be turned down at any time soon. In fact, Vladimir Putin has all the economic incentives to continue to recapitalize his military. And while that may immediately threaten Ukraine in the near future, it could also mean a real challenge to Europe. And in some ways, the resolution of the war in Ukraine, I think, puts the firing line square on European states, especially in the Baltics. And at the same time, the United States has indicated two things. One, that it is intent on pulling out of Europe or significantly reducing its force presence. And let's be clear, I think that's what is currently being planned and being thought about at the Pentagon and in the Trump administration. And then number two, and I think this is also very worrying, is establishing a new partnership or beneficial relations between the United States and Russia. And so that really calls into question, how can NATO function if, number one, the U.S. is not really there militarily, and number two, if the U.S. is trying to have a partnership with the very country that Europe is preparing for war against. And I think that is a deep challenge. And I think what we're seeing is Europeans, frankly, recognizing that and beginning to take real action.
If we take firstly the broader US attitude to Europe, Do you see that as a Trump specific problem, as a sort of anomaly in the broader trajectory of relations, or do you think that does reflect a broader shift in US priorities?
Yes and no. So the yes part, I think there has been real growing apathy toward Europe, towards NATO. It was something that, all US presidents would realize they have to go to NATO and have their sort of hand kissed by all the European leaders. And we really took NATO and Europe for granted. And this has particularly been developing since 9/11. You now have a generation of foreign policy hands around my age that have spent almost no time thinking about Europe, or in some ways are part of the post-Cold War generation of American policymakers. And so NATO is sort of this distant, somewhat archaic structure, and a real sense of disappointment that the Europeans don't do more. And so a real sense of, the Europeans are a big time suck on American foreign policy without providing a lot. Now, I disagree with that assessment, but that apathy is sort of shared, I think, in a bipartisan way. And our real focus, we want to focus on China, on the Indo-Pacific. And so that apathy, I think, is really there in both parties. It's when there's a war on in Europe, we then shift back to focus on Europe, but that is a real temporary shift. But what is different, I think, about Trump is a real sense of angst towards Europe, a sense that Europe isn't simply not pulling their weight, but shares a different ideological perspective on the world. It looks down on MAGA ideology, so to speak. And you see that with J.D. Vance coming to Europe and saying his main thrust of his remarks was about the EU's Digital Services Act and the need for Europe to become more right-wing in its outlook effectively. So you also have this ideological split that I think is really apparent in the Trump administration that probably wouldn't be in a Democratic administration, but the apathy, I think, is really underlying a lot of this. The sense that Europe doesn't matter that much in the world, I think it's wrong, but that's where I think they're coming from.
And then you mentioned this potentially more fundamental shift then away from Europe and towards aligning with Russia. I mean, how serious do you think the threat of that sort of realignment could be?
I think it's quite serious. President Trump has an affinity for Vladimir Putin and has sought to establish better relations between the US and Russia from the moment that he took office in 2017. And he's been entirely consistent about that, as well as his antipathy toward NATO and European allies. I think what we have seen is a president that wants to engage with Vladimir Putin, wants to establish better relations, and doesn't care very much about Ukraine, and so therefore just sort of wants the war to end. Whether or not that advantages or disadvantages Ukraine, I think is sort of secondary to his concerns. I think there's a lot of challenges to establishing better relations with Russia. Fundamentally, it's not really in our economic interest. There isn't that much to be gained. And I don't think a lot of US companies are going to start running in and investing in Russia when there could be another administration in 4 years that reapplies sanctions and takes a much stronger approach. But I do think that we will see a diplomatic effort to improve relations, and we've already been seeing some of that.
Can you give us a sense or just spell out what that means for NATO in particular, given the centrality of the role the United States has played in that alliance over the decades?
Well, I think it poses a deep and tremendous challenge to NATO. There's been a lot of rhetoric about Europeans creating a European pillar within NATO, essentially to organize themselves as Europeans, including the UK, and to sort of have a kind of distinct structure that then would work with the United States. The problem is that doesn't exist, because NATO effectively doesn't have Europe in its name and its outlook. I was at NATO headquarters last week, and it dawned on me that no one is really doing the defense planning or thinking, or at least officially doing this, about what happens when the US, significantly cuts its force presence in Europe. How does Europe defend itself if the United States isn't there? If the United States isn't providing, the air tankers, the airlift, in the intelligence capacity, what does Europe do? No one is doing that because NATO is a consensus-based organization in which the United States is not just a member, but is the foundational member, making up around 50% of NATO's, force presence. So that is a huge, huge challenge for Europe. And so what I think I see is a lot of Europeans scrambling to figure out what's the alternative. I see a lot of folks trying to avoid the elephant in the room, which is the European Union, where it does have an embryonic command and control structure that has been created since, in the 1990s. There is a European defense pillar within the EU. And I think the much easier way would be to activate that, to expand it, and then figure out how to include the UK in it. And I think that's what Keir Starmer and the EU should be talking about. And so how Europeans simply talk to each other and manage a war without the United States is a major, major question right now.
We hear a lot of talk about defense spending commitments and which members of the NATO alliance are and are not meeting the 2% threshold. How much of this is really about the money and the spending commitments, and how much is more about this collective action problem and some of the political obstacles that you're outlining there?
It's both. The answer is the problem is the money and the problem is the structure. What has happened over the last 2 decades is the entire focus has been on the money, because that's where the United States is focused. And what we have wanted is for Europe not to create that common European defense structure that I'm talking about, because that would impinge on US influence and authority within Europe. So what we have wanted is countries to spend more on defense. The problem there is that that does not actually solve Europe's defense problem. It is a necessary condition for more money to be allocated. The problem is that when you spread that around 27 or more than 27 countries, it really diffuses the impact. It's no shock that some countries spend a lot more on defense while others don't. So if you center the budgetary conversation of European defense in national capitals, then what you're going to get are national capitals acting in their own national interest and not a lot of collective thinking about defense. And that's the mess that we have in Europe. So I think what is imperative here is not just for Europe to spend more, but to do so more collectively in a coordinated way.
We've also begun to see in recent years NATO start to think beyond Europe, start to talk about strategic competition with China, and other US allies attend NATO summits. Could we see NATO evolve into something else that is less perhaps focused and led by the US, but still represents these collective security interests of a broader Euro-Atlantic/Western collective?
I'm quite skeptical. Look, I think part of what we saw over the last few years was that NATO prioritizes what the United States prioritizes. And so when you had Secretary of State Tony Blinken give his first speech at NATO in March of 2021, he mentioned China more than 10 times and Russia, I think, only 4 times, right? It was clear the United States, the Biden administration, was prioritizing Asia and the Indo-Pacific and the challenge of China. So NATO sort of duly followed suit to focus on China, and then a war broke out in Europe. And I think that has led to a real question within the Biden administration of NATO needs to focus on its primary threat, which is Russia. But our primary concern is not actually Russia, it is China. And so we've sort of seen a decoupling and prioritization between the United States and NATO. And that was very uncomfortable for many in NATO. Secretary General Stoltenberg, when he was there, tried to create an office in Tokyo, which I think was pretty ill-conceived. But it was trying to sort of show the Americans that NATO was going to be engaged in the Indo-Pacific. But you would talk to people here in Washington that focus on the Indo-Pacific, and they were like, NATO? We don't want NATO in the Indo-Pacific. Managing a war with our allies and partners in Asia is going to be hard enough. And everyone looked at Afghanistan and thought, yeah, that was useful, but it was a coordination nightmare. And this would be a real existential war if we ever got into it with China. So I think where we are is NATO is back to focusing on its core task, which is deterring Russia. And that's what it should be doing. And so expanding NATO into other areas, that's second, third order, and you got to really focus, I think, everything on dealing with the threat posed by Russia. The one caveat I would say is that if NATO can't really focus on the threat posed by Russia effectively because the United States is blocking or objecting, then maybe that is NATO's role, is essentially kind of a Paul Mill diplomatic coordination body as opposed to a warfighting command, which then means that Europe needs to create the warfighting command elsewhere.